This is G-Free Radio. Here's your host, Peter Stewart.
Episode 24 and more, rocking with Udis. Hello, I'm Peter Stewart. Hope you had a good week, and here we are with another one episode, 2 parts to the G-Free Radio show. In part 1, of course, we can all get a little annoyed with our situation, can't we? It takes a lot to turn your back on food that you once loved, to pay 3, 4, 5 times as much for what in many cases are just sad replicas, to miss out on meals, to adapt others, to think twice before we eat out, and always thinking of where the next toilet is. Come on, we've all done it. All that's even worse when you're a kid. You get angry, right? And who do you take that out on? Well, as the saying goes, you hurt the ones you love the most. We continue with great advice from Nikki Everett from the US rock group Raising Our Celiac Kids. We bring you more on the Twitter discussion, let's be polite, regarding comments by Paul Hollywood on the BBC this week regarding celiacs. Paul is one of the judges on the Great British Bake Off show, and what he had to say got people a little bit hot under the collar. What do you think he meant? We'll play that part of the interview. A study has been looking at the use of vitamin D supplements and how effective they are. It seems we may have been wasting our time with them and our money as well. Another report out this week suggests that probiotics could be the key to cutting your sensitivity to gluten. We'll take a look at that. Plus, we start a brief series on alternative grains. This week it's millet. What is it? Where's it from? What does it have going for it? Plus we mention Darling Spuds and a new product in their G-Free range. National newspaper recognition for one of our long-term supporters here at G-Free Radio. And a great vending machine at Malaga Airport. All that in one. In part 2, we continue with our interview with Simon Haslett of Udis on their brand expansion from the US into the UK. We hear more about the parent company, why they decided to launch here and now, and how Simon himself has baking in his blood. Plus, more than a quarter of Americans eat gluten-free foods to help them lose weight, and other new stats. The story of how one restaurant simply does G-Free right. The care, consideration, the detail and discussion. Also, cookery schools. Are they worth the money? Yet another first for a G-Free product from Marks & Spencer. And why a G-Free Christmas could be a cracker at Sainsbury's, but Tesco are left looking like turkeys. So the 4 notes, which means it's the start of another G-Free radio show. Thank you so much indeed for listening again. Our listening figures increase week on week, for which we are very, very grateful. We'll start off with the comments made by Paul Hollywood in the week to the BBC Radio Ulster in Northern Ireland. He was a guest on their Talkback programme. If you're not aware of Paul, Paul is one of the judges on the Great British Bake Off. He's been baking for many, many years. He's got a baking school. And also he's been in the United States as well on their equivalent of the Great British Bake Off, which essentially is a knockout competition along the lines of making fantastic and fabulous cakes, pastries, breads, pies, tarts, all the rest of it. If you do get an opportunity to see it, if you're in another country, then do. I know that it has been franchised to other parts of the world, but it really is something quite unusual. So we'll hear first of all what Paul Hollywood said on the radio, and then what his response was. So here he is.
Has it kind of skipped a generation? I mean, I'm not a baker. I bake wheat and bread, but my daughters both bake, and my son actually, and my mum was a great baker. But, you know, my generation, I'm wondering, maybe it was just easier to go and buy it round the corner.
I think it did. I agree. I think it did. And it's bearing it out now because the amount of youth that are picking up on the baking bug and baking their own stuff, and it's making a difference, you know, because the quality of the products now you can buy is getting better because people demand better stuff now, and I think that's where we should be.
And also, I wonder, there are a lot of people who have different digestive problems now. We talked on the programme a week or so ago about people with celiac disease, for instance, and if you're baking yourself, you can cope with that, can't you? Whereas finding someone else who's done it for you is a bit more difficult. I'm a bit sceptical about the whole celiac thing because half the time it's misdiagnosed
And what tends to happen is when people cut out wheat, they often drink more water, they eat more vegetables, they're more acutely aware of their diet, and all of a sudden they blame the whole thing on bread. It's more to do with what bread you're eating rather than the bread itself. It's to do with what goes into the bread, not the bread itself. So you have to then start eliminating things from your diet. You know, first of all, try sourdough bread, pure with nothing in it. Try wholemeal bread sourdough, pure, nothing in it. See how you get on with that. If it's horses for courses, you know. If you get, I mean, you can buy some sort of low range sliced bread, which you can almost turn back into dough. No wonder it sits on the stomach. But you've just got to be aware of what you're eating. If you pay rubbish money, then you're going to get rubbish bread, and that's the general rule. Pay more money, get better quality bread, and bread has actually gone down in price in 20 years. That's not right.
Okay, interesting stuff. I've just isolated the little bit there. Obviously, the interview went on before and after that particular clip. But what do you think Paul actually meant when he said that? You know what? I think he just got a little bit tongue-tied. And I think that he was talking about people who self-diagnose themselves as celiacs with a small c. I know you can't really self-diagnose yourself as a celiac, but really what he meant to say was people who self-diagnose themselves as gluten-free, people who choose to go gluten-free by choice and then cut out bread, whereas bread isn't necessarily the problem that's caused their funny tummy, to coin a phrase. It's just poor quality bread that has caused them to feel sick and lethargic and bloated and feel as though something heavy is sitting on their stomach. And what he was saying, I believe, is that having a better quality bread would not necessarily have those effects. Yeah? Do you agree or do you disagree? An awful lot of comments on Twitter during the course of the week. And Paul Hollywood, to give him his due, I thought was absolutely fantastic. He actually engaged with people on Twitter and answered their questions and queries and made his own points, including these. Incidentally, he said, I'm working on a load of gluten-free recipes now, which is fantastic. You may remember a few weeks ago on this programme, we talked about how on the Great British Bake Off they had some other alternative flour recipes, and several of the contestants chose spelt, which obviously isn't gluten-free, the point that we made, and indeed, to be fair, the point they made on the programme as well. And one person, Christine, who was subsequently knocked out that week, unfortunately, chose her own blend of different flours of potato, and I think it had tapioca and things like that in as well. He also then went on to say, problem is, I've dealt with flour all my life, and my recipes need a lot of adjusting, but the wheat intolerance crowd have hijacked celiac, which I think backs up what I was saying, what I think Paul meant in that interview. And then in another tweet a little bit later on, I'm pushing for Bake Off to do more gluten-free for next year. Watch this space, which would be fantastic. So congratulations to him. And also, and this got a huge reaction, as you can imagine, I may ask a few of the gluten-free friends on Twitter down to my baking school to play with some recipes. Who is in? Well, needless to say, we've put in our representations to be there for the G3 radio show, and if we are chosen, then obviously we'll make sure that we do some recordings and we put those on the programme in a subsequent edition. We've also approached Paul separately to do an interview with us to explain what he meant. So if you're listening to this, Paul, you know, we're big fans. We've been talking about the Great British Bake Off for several weeks, and we think we've interpreted what you were saying correctly. But obviously, that is likely to cause a little consternation, I think, among some people, and also maybe a bit of confusion among people, particularly the non-celiac community. And in that, I'm going to put the self-diagnosed gluten-freers as well. But it's very, very difficult, isn't it? And I can only back up what @MillerCath said, Kath Miller on Twitter. I think Paul Hollywood has made a lot of new friends this evening. So @Paul Hollywood if you want to follow him. Let's move on then and talk about a few other subjects. The Mail Online published this in the week. Now, we know that celiacs have a predisposition to osteoporosis. and they said no bone boost from vitamin D. Study finds supplements are a waste of time for women trying to prevent osteoporosis. So not specifically gluten-free, but as I say, it does link in with what we have and what we have to do and what's possibly down the line for us. Taking vitamin D supplements does not improve bone strength and is a waste of time for women trying to stave off osteoporosis, claim researchers. Professor Ian Reid from the University of Auckland in New Zealand and colleagues carried out a systematic review of 23 randomised trials. The results did not show any effects for people who took vitamin D for an average period of 2 years, apart from a small increase in bone density at the femoral neck. That forms part of the hip joint. But this change would be unlikely to provide any real medical benefits to the individual, says the report. Continuing widespread use of vitamin D for osteoporosis prevention in community-dwelling adults without specific risk factors for vitamin D deficiency seems to be inappropriate. I'm paraphrasing this quite a long report. Dr. Claire Bowring, Medical Policy Manager of the National Osteoporosis Society, said vitamin D is essential for good bone health. This latest study supports what the National Osteoporosis Society has been saying for years. The best source for most people is safe summer sunlight exposure, and that only people at risk of vitamin D deficiency should take a supplement. In the UK, the Food Standards Agency does not recommend a specific daily dose of vitamin D unless you are elderly, pregnant, Asian, get little sun exposure, and eat no meat or oily fish when 10 mcg is advised. The danger with taking excessive doses for long periods is that the body absorbs too much calcium, which could weaken bones and possibly damage liver and kidneys. And as we all often say on the programme, obviously seek medical advice for your own personal situation about the amount of vitamin D that you are taking and whether or not you should be taking more or less or cut back, or whether it should be pills or naturally occurring vitamin D in food. And that's something perhaps we can be talking about in a few weeks' time. And just ahead of our interview, as we continue our conversation with Nikki Everett from Rock, raising our celiac kids, probiotics could be the key to reducing gluten sensitivity. A long and quite complicated report. I won't spend too much on this, but if you want to know more, newswire.net is the place to go, and punch in probiotics benefit gluten sensitivity, and this report I'm sure will come up. Grain-based foods have been part of the human diet for thousands of years, and some of the healthiest diets, including the Mediterranean diet, contain a good amount of wheat and other whole grains. Many traditional societies known for longevity have diets including grains as a major component of the diet. These cultures also have an absence of history of intestinal problems. So the question is, has humanity been poisoning itself with wheat and other gluten-containing grains, including barley, rye and others, or is something else going on? And then there's quite a bit of detail that goes into it, but let's cut to the chase. Let's cut, as you can probably hear the shuffling of papers here in the studio, let's cut to the last couple of paragraphs from this report. And it says, the fact that gluten sensitivities have been growing as the use of antibiotics and antiseptics have become increasingly utilised together with the findings that enzymes produced by probiotics break down gluten and gliadin into non-toxic constituents. It boils down to that our gut microflora has everything to do with wheat and other gluten sensitivities. You know what? I've read that several times, and that's an awfully long sentence. I'm not entirely sure I thoroughly identify what they're trying to say, but something to do with the gut? Listen to this next part. But avoiding all forms of gluten in our diets can not only be difficult, if not impossible, it may be unnecessary if we learn to maintain healthy intestinal probiotics. And I know a few of you are going to agree with that. Again, I've read that paragraph a couple of times, and after the second or third time I realised that, in fact, it is badly written. There are a few words missing out in that sentence, which I've put in to aid, not digestion, but to aid understanding. Research from the UK has determined that gluten grains also provide critical nourishment, prebiotics, for our intestinal probiotics. 55 healthy men and women were given different doses of a wheat bran for 3 weeks. Those eating more wheat bran showed an increase in healthy probiotic bifidobacteria in their intestines and colons. As I say, I've read the first couple of paragraphs, the last couple of paragraphs. There's a couple of pages in betwixt and in between, which talks about probiotics and, some really complicated names. Let's give this one a go. Prolyl endopeptidase and all sorts of things. But essentially, if you want more on that, newswire.net, punch in probiotics benefit gluten sensitivity or 00077 which seems to be the number of that report on that there website. It is the G3 radio show. Coming up in this part, we're going to be talking, well, we mentioned alternative grains, didn't we, a few moments ago. We're going to be looking at millet and where that has come from over the last few years. And what you can do with it. And incidentally, if you've got any good millet recipes, I'd love to hear from them and share them. So you can contact me on Twitter at G3Radio or also g3radio@hotmail.com if there's something more lengthy that you want to cut and paste to us. If not, point us, as I say, to a website. Christmas is not far away. So we're going to be talking about some Christmas foods in part 2, together with the second part of our interview with Simon from Udi's UK. But first of all, this part and this interview, tough being a kid, of course, isn't it, if you can remember back, and even tougher, of course, if you've got celiac disease. As well as the health issues, there's the whole unfairness of the situation. This week on the G3 radio show, we hear more from Nikki Everett, a great supporter of the show. And Nikki, we really appreciate your support and your retweets and so on. Nikki, if you missed last week's episode, why? It's still available on iTunes and on YouTube, and also the very place that you've got this via our main server at Spreaker.com. Nikki is from Rock. Great name, as I said before, Raising Our Celiac Kids, the branch or chapter in Charlotte, North Carolina. And she starts off telling us this week about how angry her daughter was after her diagnosis.
Number one, when you have a child that has been diagnosed, you feel like you've been poisoning them. So there's an amount of guilt that you have anyway. So whenever she was angry and she would get angry at me, it was more a displacement, of course, of her anger over the general overall situation and her diagnosis. But I was the one that she could blame it on at that moment because I was saying, no, you can't have that. So, of course, that's why I realized we had to take that element out and make it so that she realized this wasn't me that was saying she couldn't have it. It was because of the company.
And when you realised that you couldn't, with respect, pronounce some of these words on the side of a packet either, did that make you think, hold on, I would normally have eaten this myself? And did that make you reconsider your own diet and that of the rest of your family?
Absolutely. I say that I was a good cook, but I wasn't a baker. So to learn all of that and to learn how to cook, especially Southern style food, because I am a Southerner in the United States, which was the food she grew up with. I wanted to replace some of those foods. I had to learn how to do that because I'd never had to make gravy from scratch with no wheat flour, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it was a big awakening for all of us to eat more slow food, local food, grass-fed beef, grass-fed meat, free range. All of those things started coming into play. Before then, I was a single mother, and of course, the bottom line on my grocery bill was more important than anything else, and then that became less of an importance.
And the Southern food diet, I mean, I've travelled quite a bit in the Southern United States. From my perspective as, kind of restaurant food, as it were, that can be quite heavy. It can be quite breaded and fried and things like that, can't it?
It can. It doesn't mean all of it, but yes, It can. So what I did was I endeavored to make things less unhealthy and yet still meet her taste buds. So that was a challenge in itself as well. But yes, it can be. And especially like I have an event that I run in New Orleans in Louisiana. That is an area that it is very prevalent. And they've had a hard time being able to go out to eat in their favorite restaurants with Cajun food because of it.
You said as a single mum, the bottom line on your grocery bill was one of the most important things. I mean, it is very difficult over here, over there, I'm sure around the world, where the gluten-free alternatives are so much more expensive, 3, 4, 5, 6 times as expensive. This causes problems, doesn't it? Particularly over there where you're not so much helped with your food bill as you can be over here with our National Health Service. How do the poorer members of society cope if you are celiac?
It is extremely difficult. I will say that is one of when I do the events that we run, which are community-based, we set up as much as we can to help those in need. As a matter of fact, I just met an individual who is sick and disabled, and she's on food stamps, and basically they can't afford it at all. So they have to do without.
And so the choice is then, you know that with every mouthful you are making yourself sick, if not in the next couple of hours, then maybe in the next few years, because the long-term effects of continuing putting gluten into your stomach.
Well, and I don't know that they do that as much as they try to eat real food. But as we both know, real food can be expensive as well. It's not subsidized, which it is in the United States. Wheat is a subsidized crop here, which makes those wheat products much cheaper than anything else. And so this is a very big problem here in the United States, and it has been since we've seen such a recession.
So let's get back to the rock group. You're saying that you're going through the various sessions with the kids that you've got there, giving them these coping strategies that they're able to swap ideas as well. I would guess that it is particularly difficult with the kind of culture that you mentioned there. And I guess another part of that growing up with celiac disease is things like getting into dating and wanting to go to a drive-through, or maybe it's going to be a pizza place or a ball game and that kind of stuff. You want to fit in, don't you, as a teenager? You want to go with your girlfriends and your and your boyfriends to these kind of events.
Well, actually, I think it starts earlier than that. I think preteens are actually where it begins, because as preteens, they're trying to figure out who they are, and they're trying to fit into groups. And then it continues on through the dating process. And the dating process is vital to this whole talk that we're having. It is definitely a difficult process to go through for young adults, especially if if they're so sensitive that they can't even touch someone's hand after they've had wheat, or they can't kiss them on the lips. So this adds all new dimensions to dating. And as I've tried to explain to my daughter and prepare her for that in the future, if a gentleman is not going to be gentlemanly about it, he's not the right one. And so we try to keep enforcing those positive ideals over the whole process. But of course, she's going to go through the letdown emotionally if it doesn't go that way.
And presumably this is the time that she may start taking risks, because she wants to fit in and she wants to be liked, she wants to be loved.
Absolutely. The doctor that she goes to see here is a specialist, and he explained to me that I would have to look at in the near future the possibility that she would cheat, even though I have devoted my whole life to educating about it, even though she's been involved in that from the process. There would be a time where she would cheat in that situation, most likely. All I can do is impress upon her that it is a risk assessment that she's making, and is the risk worth it? And that's all I can do.
So she's getting lots of support from the group. Obviously, you're giving lots of support to the group as well. I guess the whole family is behind Erin in this?
Absolutely. When my husband met me, he met Erin a couple months later, and we met at a restaurant, as a matter of fact, and he was having a biscuit at the time. He reached out to touch her hand, and she said, "I'm sorry, I can't touch your hand. I can never kiss you. I can never hug you if you've eaten wheat." And he went gluten-free the next weekend. I don't see that support across the board with spouses, and that's become an issue in the community, and we talk about it widely. It's very, very difficult for families to get together and get on board with it.
And in fact, I was reading a blog, a message board the other day with people saying that they've come to blows in their relationship, I think quite literally in some occasions, and also that it's led to divorce because one husband or wife has accused the other one of making up the whole celiac disease thing, or going gluten-free, or an intolerance, calling them picky and just being awkward. It's incredible, isn't it?
It is incredible. I would think that is the person that should be the one person who stands behind you, but of course that isn't always the case. And I know that dietary change is difficult, and as we talked about before, you go through a grief process. At the same time, it makes only sense to me that you would try to support that person that you love. So that goes across the board for me and my family. It is not the case very often, and most often in most families, where they will divide their refrigerator, they will divide their pantry and try to label their foods, and even go so far as making separate meals. And I just find that ridiculous. You should eat together, and it should be a communal thing.
Nikki Everett from Raising Our Celiac Kids, and you can follow her, GF Irresistibly, and I know she would appreciate that. And I wonder if there's a few things that we can adapt, or we can use in the UK with the Celiac UK Youth Group and other youth groups around the world for those with celiac issues. So, as I say, I'm sure if you contact Nikki at GF Irresistibly, she'll point you in the right direction and help out as much as she can. Great stuff. Thank you so much, Nikki, for your time. So, first, in a short series looking at various different grains, their provenance and how to cook with them, I realised there was quite a few things coming out over the last few weeks and months about some of these various grains. And I say short because we're not going to be spending much time. There's no interview attached to these. Maybe we could do that in a subsequent a series of episodes in the forthcoming months or years. But I just thought I'd dip my toe in the water, first of all, because I'm interested myself in some of these alternative grains. I mean, you know, there's amaranth and sorghum and quinoa, heritage grains, they're often calling them now, aren't they? Grandfather grains is another phrase that I've heard. Ancient grains, I know, is the phrase used by Udis. And there's another age-old grain that often you don't hear too much about, and that's just ordinary plain old millet. It's got some really fantastic qualities I've been reading recently. It's drought tolerant, and nutritionally it competes with quinoa that obviously we know people are clamouring to eat and clamouring to grow. There's a huge movement in the United States at the moment. American farmers are clamouring to grow that. Millet hasn't quite taken off in the same way, has it? And that's partly to do with production issues, as I understand, the way it's grown, and so on, and also it's got a bit of an image problem, doesn't it? We'll come to that in a moment. First of all, let's talk about the positives, the pluses. It's got many things going for it. It's gluten-free, of course. It's high in protein, and it can be marketed, and this is a phrase, forgive me, I hadn't come across before. It can be marketed to locavores. I had to look up this word. I don't like to admit something I don't know very often. I often think it's best just go away, look it up, and come back and pretend, now you do know what it means, and just pass it off generally. Don't need to crow about it, but you've learned something. What is a locavore? Are you in the same boat as me? Did you know what a locavore was? Locavores. I know someone who does know. We're going to be talking about her in the next part of this particular episode, and that's Rosie. We'll come to Rosie in a few moments. Locavores, people who eat locally produced food. Kind of makes sense now, you know that, doesn't it, with the derivation of the word and the root there, locavores. But there's a millet image problem. Most shoppers, if they've heard of it at all, equate millet with bags of birdseed. Absolutely. I've never eaten millet, and partly because of that reason, partly because you don't actually see it around much, apart from birdseed. I don't have a bird, but if I were to find myself in a pet shop, I would not be surprised to see millet in a bag on the shelf. I don't think I've ever seen a recipe with it, but you can. It's not exactly the first choice when picking out a side dish, having millet, Perhaps people might think you don't use a spoon or fork, you bob your head down and peck at it like a pigeon. Last year, farmers hit a huge setback when the usually drought-tolerant millet withered under exceptionally hot and dry conditions in America. Colorado specifically, according to this particular report from NPR, some farmers lost up to 80% of their crop. Millet is already eaten widely across Asia and Africa, but only in small pockets in North America. Unlike almost every other crop grown in the country, no trade associations exist to market millet. Instead, it's just a loose group of farmers with support from state agriculture officials promoting millet, which makes it tough, understandably, to break into new markets. I'm intrigued after reading that and bringing that to you and reading it again for you on the G3 radio show about millet, and I'm going to have to root out a few millet recipes. I'm hesitating there because I'm thinking, where would I get human edible millet from? Can I just buy the birdseed stuff? I'm thinking not. I would be much more reassured if it came from a health food shop. So I'm intrigued. If you've got any good millet recipes, because I've tried the teffs and so on, and teff is coming up in a few weeks' time. But millet, interesting stuff. Okay, we're nearly at the end of part one of this particular episode of the G3 radio show. Cookery schools in part two, and also continuing our second part with Simon Hazlitt, and also about an intriguing, I don't know whether you saw this in the week, the intriguing vending machine at an airport in Spain. Before we go, congratulations to Darling Spuds Crisps at Darling Spuds. If you want to lend their support, it's our kind of version of an FF by mentioning these companies with their Twitter names. At Darling Spuds, they've launched Darling's Popcorn, so fantastic to them. I think it's only in Tesco at the moment, so if you find yourself in that particular store, then look out for that. And I'll tell you what, let's bring you that story, because I love this picture, I love this story. We'll bring it to you now about the vending machine for people at Malaga Airport in Spain. And Mr. Ed the Horse on Twitter sent out this during the course of the week, and it was favourited and retweeted all over the shop. Never seen one of these before. A food vending machine for gluten-free and lactose people at Malaga Airport. So if you look in his Twitter feed, you will see, and I'm just holding this up to the microphone. Can you see this? And that is quite obviously a vending machine, the like of which you've seen many times before, but specific sections of it, different tiers for gluten-free and lactose-free and organic and sugar-free, and various products. Can't actually see what the products are, but that's not really the point. The point is that this exists. That is absolutely fantastic. I'm not entirely sure how we can get in touch with the people that run this or market this particular vending machine, but maybe we should and do a little interview with them. Actually, you know what? I'm just blowing this up. And you can actually make out nutritionalvending.com, I think it is. So it's worth getting in touch with them and showing them your support. Nutritional is actually spelt N-U-T, and before you think, yeah, we know how to spell nutritional, Peter, you know, don't treat us as fools. It's because it is spelt a little bit differently on this. Nutritional, nutritional vending. So there you go. This is the G3 radio show. End of part one. A quick reprise of what's going to be in part two then. More from Simon Hazlitt. More on a quarter of Americans eating gluten-free foods to help them lose weight, and other interesting stats out this week. That thing on cookery schools, and also we're going to be mentioning Sainsbury's and Tesco's again, and also our favourite friends at Marks and Spencer's, and also a gluten-free restaurant that just does things right.